Hi there, this is Jeremy Rowe, also known as J Rowe, the Unsummoned Skull, and Coach J Rowe. You can find me on Twitter at Coach_J_RO. My Twitch stream will be is Monday through Thursday, 9 p.m. Same skull time, same skull channel, which is twitch.tv/unsummoned skull. You can also find me on Discord. My server is called the Skull Symbol. It's an up and coming community which looks for games and works has a lot of people working together to do cool stuff. This is the first episode of Quote of Arms, which is my new podcast. It's going to focus on weird and wacky tribal Magic the Gathering decks, looking at what the tribe is, what their identity is, how each of the jobs gets done within the deck so that it functions well, how it wins, and what makes that tribe interesting and worth building around. Coat of Arms is a Magic card where creatures of the same type boost each other's power regardless of who owns them. Quote of Arms is a similarly inclusive podcast supporting diverse voices while strengthening the kindred aspects of our lives. So, what's your favorite or under-supported tribe? The tribe I'm going to be focusing on today is my dog tribal deck. This is a gruel colored deck, which is green and red, and the commander for the deck is Paco Arcane Retriever. Paco is usually paired with Haldan, who is a blue human that works with Paco's abilities. Paco himself is a 3/3 for 5 that has haste, and whenever it attacks, exile the top card of each player's library and put a fetch counter on each of them. Put a +1/+1 counter on Paco for each non-creature card exiled this way. Now, Haldan, if he was in the deck, would allow me to cast other people's spells that way. But it's also difficult to resolve that off of spell table, so doesn't really play well with online play, which is most of what I'm doing nowadays. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose to have Paco free from Haldan. Additionally, I wanted the dogs here to be just dogs, not necessarily owned by anybody or being forced or made to do anything. They are free, they are wild, and they are capable of some crazy things. Now, some background on this tribe. I have wanted a dog since I was little. It's one of the things that I wanted more than just about anything in this world. But with a very small exception of the time when I was at college living in an apartment, I really haven't lived on my own, and even in that apartment, we weren't allowed to have pets. So I've never been allowed to own a pet, and I've always kind of wanted one. So the impetus for basing something off of dogs comes from the fact that I love dogs. I enjoy playing with them whenever I go over to somebody's house who owns one. I have a best friend who has a dog which is adorable. Her name is Lexi. I love giving her belly rubs, but I've never been allowed to have a pet of my own, and so this was kind of my attempt to make an ASMR deck. So make a deck that just looking at it makes me feel all warm and fuzzy and happy, and whenever I play it, I really enjoy it. So that same friend that I just mentioned who has this cute little dog, Lexi, who is a poodle, Shih Tzu, and mutt with a couple of other things probably thrown in there. Well, there was a secret layer that was made that had to do with dogs. And I received that from this friend for my birthday last year. And last year was a really tough mental health year for a lot of people. It's 2020. People were concerned about the White House, about different scandals that were going on, about the COVID epidemic and crisis. Quite a lot of these are still problems, but this is a time when I was feeling really alone. I hadn't quite started to develop a social media presence yet, and so I felt closed off from the rest of the world. And so this was a friend reaching out to me, providing something that he knew meant a lot to me. And so what I didn't realize was that these cards aren't necessarily closely related to each other or to the tribes. So the two secret layer cards that are in this deck are Ancient Grudge, which shows a picture of a cute little pug and a broken mirror, and it's barking at its mirror self because it destroys 2 artifacts. The other one is Lightning Greaves, which shows looks like a beagle playing around with a pair of large boots, which are metallic because they're lightning greaves. Lightning greaves happens to be a fairly commonplace commander card. It's one that's usually used to protect creatures. It can also give them haste. And so that's one of the sub-themes of the deck, is giving these creatures haste or being able to just keep attacking. And the fact that the Greaves can get tossed around and give my new creatures haste is a big deal in the deck because these creatures want to attack and they want to attack together. Because after all, dogs are dogs are domesticated forms of the wolf, and wolves travel in packs. Ancient Grudge was a bit tougher of a fit, though. It's not entirely clear what Ancient Grudge is doing in the deck besides happening to destroy artifacts. So, this deck doesn't have a ton of removal, and Ancient Grudge does provide it with another way to destroy things. There's often going to be somebody who has some kind of an artifact that you want to get rid of, and it makes sense for the dogs to be burying things in the dirt, so it made sense to have the card in the deck, even if it's not the most flavorful card or the most EDH-centered card. It makes sense to have that in there. So the reason why I wanted to make this deck is because, 1, I wanted to honor dogs, 2, I wanted to honor my friend, and 3, I wanted a little bit of a challenge. So I'm always looking for different ways to use unsummon effects. And the way that Unsummon works in here is with cards like Adaptive Automaton and Door of Destinies, which have triggers when creatures enter the battlefield. My heaven cards are returned to my hand to later re-enter the battlefield. With cards like Erratic Portal, I'm able to trigger those things multiple times. There are also some cards that have abilities when they enter the battlefield that I can reuse. One of those is a little doggo named Bolthound. Bolthound has haste, which is always nice with this deck. And when it attacks, other creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. Well, one of the things I can do is have it attack and then bounce it out of combat if it doesn't have enough pumps or if it would otherwise die in combat. I can use that to help protect it. There's also Mogus's Warhound, which has Bestow. I can always Erratic Portal the creature that it's bestowed upon and then recast the Warhound so that I can increase the amount of bodies that I have. Quite often I wind up finding that I need more bodies. There are also a few cards in here that I would not normally put into a deck, but I'm fine with them being in a deck like this. For example, I have Concordant Crossroads in here, which gives creatures haste, and is in green, which is an unusual color to be able to give things haste. It also only costs 1, so it's really easy to get out. Now, it's also a really, really expensive card. I would not put that into most decks because it would just seem like I'm flexing on people. But putting it in a dog deck and explaining that it's so that the dogs can attack as a pack makes flavorful sense. It doesn't feel like I'm flexing on people because, yes, I'm using an expensive card, but I'm not really using it as well as it could possibly be used. I'm not like giving a 7/7 haste or something like that, or Avengers Zendikar, play a land, give them all haste. I'm giving dogs haste. If you're angry at that, well, you should look back at yourself when you're thinking about the fact that you're playing with dogs. Urza's Incubator is in here as well, which is another expensive card, but it is a tribal-oriented card. And so that one I'm again okay with because it's a tribal-oriented card. It's not that... so that one in particular isn't as expensive. It's been reprinted semi-recently. And so no problems with that either. One of the ramp cards in the deck, though, is Allaren. And Allaren is one that can give people some pause because, again, it's an expensive card. It is a card that can be used for combos. There's an Allaren and Harpy combo where it's a blue and black Harpy. You put it out, you pay a life, you put it back in your hand, and you just put it out, put it out, put it out as many times as you want to. If you have, say, an Essence Warden, you can get infinite end of the battlefield effects. I'm not looking to do that. I'm just looking to cheat out dogs. I can get them out at instant speed, so I can give them pseudo haste that way. I can also put them out for free. Now, any player can do that, so Allaren does have a pretty bad reverse effect on it, in that it's a double-edged sword, they can use it too, and it can potentially kill me. I do also have Mana Echoes in the deck, which is another relatively expensive card, but if I'm making X colorless, where X is the amount of dogs I control, again, dogs are not a very supported tribe. I'm playing a lot of bad cards because they just happen to be dogs. And so if people are upset about that, I guess it's just going to happen. One more card that I have in here that is expensive that I was trying to find a home for is Gaia's Cradle. Gaia's Cradle is another very expensive land. It taps to make X green, where X is the amount of creatures you control. Again, I'm not making a lot of tokens. I'm not going that wide. I'm just making dogs. So just like with those other cards, those are cards that happen to work well with a board of creatures, but I'm really not looking to exploit them that much. So what makes dogs interesting to me is that, first off, they're cute. They're adorable. Some of the pictures are really cute too, like Jackal Pup. It's an absolutely adorable art. So they're a relatively new tribe. In fact, only a few cards in here actually have dog on them. A lot of them are hounds. Some of them are jackals. But those have been errated to all be dogs. So as a result of them all being dogs, they share all of these tribal synergies and allow the deck to function. So this is a deck that prior to Core Set 21 could not have existed because dog was not a supported tribe. So that's one thing about them. Another thing is, since these cards, for the most part, were not printed in a set that had dog-related support, and were not intended to be considered of the same creature type, there really isn't a lot that they have in common. Most of them are from different sets. I'm not even sure if there are that many of them from the same set. Besides maybe Igneous Curse from Core Set 21 and Bolt Hounds from 21. Otherwise, I don't think there are that many cards from the same set even in the deck. So this is a creature type that was previously non-existent. Now it's unsupported, and it doesn't really have much of an identity. So what that allowed me to do was to create my own identity for the cards. I was able to look at them and say, okay, what do I want them to be? How do I want them to function? And that's where I started thinking about wolves. Wolves are another supported type. They have, actually, from Innistrad, several cards that reference wolves. They have some previous cards like Master of the Wild Hunt that reference wolves specifically. So, dogs are kind of a blank canvas for me. They were a chance for me to see, okay, what do I want this tribe to be? And how does that relate to some of the things that exist already? So wolves are mostly related to packs. Howl of the Night Pack makes a bunch of wolves. So wolves are mostly about going wide, doing some fighting, because it makes sense for wolves to be biting stuff, and otherwise really just going wide and not having a lot to do with each other. There aren't a lot of things that necessarily pump wolves. There is a Lord for wolves, I believe, from Innistrad, but there aren't a lot of cards that specifically reference the wolf creature type, and so they would function similarly to the way the dogs would function. So when I was building the deck, that's one of the thoughts I had in mind, was if wolves go wide and they need generic support mostly related to going wide in combat, why can't dogs work the same way? So the identity the deck has a lot to do with digging things out of the ground. So I have some cards like Regenesis, Elvish Soul Tiller, Ancient Grudge itself, that are related to digging things out of the ground. There are some cards that are related sort of symbolically or just in terms of like what they look like and the card art to dogs, like Navinural's Disc, because it looks like a frisbee. And of course, dogs would be going to try to catch any frisbee. But what happens when they try to catch Navinural's Disc? Well, unfortunately, it blows up everything, including them. They say curiosity killed the cat, while trying to catch Navinural's Disc killed the dogs. It's unfortunate, but it happens. There's also some cards like Greater Good. Now, Greater Good is a card where I have it in there to draw cards. It's a general green card draw spell, and there are times when I'll be in combat and things might die, and I'll be like, you know what, I'd like to get something out of that. But flavorfully, Greater Good kind of represents what happens in Old Yeller and Where the Red Fern Grows. Spoiler alert, in both of those stories, the dog winds up causing problems and eventually needing to get put down. In fact, 3 dogs die between 2 books. That's actually why there's a parody book that's called No More Dead Dogs, which is about a guy who refuses to do a play about Old Yeller, and instead wants to rewrite it so that the dog survives. Now, I can certainly relate to that, because that's one of the reasons why I chose not to be a veterinarian. So again, connected to why dogs, which was the first point. When I was in 8th grade, I wanted to be a veterinarian. Actually, all the way up until that point. I love dogs. I wanted to be around them anytime in any way that I could. My parents were kind of getting in the way of that. And so I dreamed of being a veterinarian, where I could be around dogs all day long and my parents couldn't say or do anything about it, because it was my profession. Well, then I had to interview a veterinarian, and I have an uncle who's a veterinarian in California, and I asked him what the hardest part of his job was, and he said having to go to shelters and put animals down. So that was the end of that dream. At that point, I decided I didn't want to be a veterinarian anymore. But it is true that sometimes dogs need to get put down, and when they are put down, it's usually framed that it's for the greater good. A sad little reference in there. Maybe if I could get an altar, it would be something like the cover of Old Yeller or something like that. But there are also dogs that have some positives that occur when they die. For example, Mongrel Pack is a 4/1 for 4, which doesn't sound like it sounds like a very aggressive card. It doesn't sound like a very efficient card, but if it dies in combat, I make 4 Hound tokens, which are dog tokens now, that are 1/1 green creatures. Mongrel Pack is one of the few ways the deck has to make more than one body on one card. Now it says, if it's put into any graveyard from play during combat, it does not say that it has to die due to combat damage. So where that comes is, I attack with the Mongrel Pack, and then sacrifice it to Greater Good. Greater Good draws cards based on its power, not its toughness. So I draw 4 cards and then discard 3 to the Greater Good. At least 4, that's assuming it wasn't pumped some other way. If I have the Automaton out, it gets +1/+1, so now I'm drawing 5 cards. If I have Shared Animosity out, its power goes through the roof because it gets +1/+0 for each other attacking dog. And in that case, I can draw quite a lot of cards. Immolating Soul Eater is another way of getting a lot of power in one body. Immolating Soul Eater is a 1/1 for 2, which doesn't seem all that great, but for a Phyrexian red mana, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So it can potentially get really big really quickly, and if I want to, I can turn that extra power into more cards from Greater Good, sort of creating my own greed, except I don't have to pay any mana for it. So take that, Black Decks! I can draw cards too. It's not very efficient, but it works. There are also quite a lot of ways to win the game through combat by increasing the amount of damage I'm doing. For example, one of the flavorful cards in the deck is Strength of the Pack. I mentioned that the dogs in this deck function like wolves. Wolves attack in packs. The dogs in here attack in packs. So one of the cards in here that's really flavorful is Strength of the Pack, which puts 2+1/+1 counters on each creature I control. Now, it's also not incredibly efficient. It costs 6. There are plenty of better ways to pump creatures, but it has pack in the name. I kinda gotta put it in there. And it does a good job of making my otherwise tiny creatures more threatening. Shared Animosity, though, is probably the fastest win con the deck has. Whenever a creature attacks, or a creature I control anyways attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a type. It does a lot of damage very quickly. Overwhelming Stampede also does a lot of damage very quickly. Creatures I control get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures I control. Paco can get fairly unbounded in terms of how much power it has, because it gets a +1/+1 counter for each non-creature card that's exiled whenever it attacks. So it can get potentially 4 power on it every turn, which kills people really quickly. And with Overwhelming Stampede, Overcome, Overrun, all these different ways to add trample to it, it gets even more deadly. Paco can kill somebody with commander damage, and I have seen that happen. It can also be used with the Overwhelming Stampede to bash people in, and it gives a little bit of haste power with regards to its ability, because it has haste as well. Conquering Crossroads is awesome because it gives haste to everything else, but a number of creatures in the deck already have haste, so they come down and they join into the pack attack. Now, the scarier thing happens when the creatures decide that they're going to gang up on somebody. That's often what happens with an aggressive deck, and this is a pretty aggressive deck. So I can gang up on somebody with a bunch of small creatures, and then use one of my finisher effects to just bash them down. Another cool thing about the deck is that it does have the signature card of the cast, which is Coat of Arms in it. It's a risk because it's a tribal deck, and it's possible it could face other tribal decks which have more support. But people get surprised by the things that happen to be dogs. If somebody's running, say, Rambunctious Mutt, they happen to pump all of my guys too. And Rambunctious Mutt is a naturalize on a stick, and so it's not a bad card to put into a deck. There's also a new dog there's a dog from M21, sacrifices itself to give a creature indestructible. Well, if I drop Coat of Arms, all of a sudden they might not want to keep that thing out. The deck does have some card draw in it. The card draw isn't necessarily wonderful. It has Greater Good, it has Regenesis, it has Descendant's Path, which is a card that I don't see used that often. Descendant's Path, at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card that shares a creature type with a creature you control, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Otherwise, put that card in the bottom of the library. So it can give you a free cast every turn as long as you're in a tribal deck. However, it can also sometimes put things down that you'd rather get earlier. Return to the Wildspeaker is great in this deck because every card is a non-human, and so I can draw a lot of cards, because the draw cards equal the greatest power among non-human creatures, and that's usually where Paco comes in. Or I can give my non-human creatures +3/+3 at instant speed, which means I can attack somebody, have them line up blocks, and then return to the Wildspeaker to blow them out. Either to allow my creatures to survive, or to punch through extra damage, or sometimes even both. That's when you get lots of value. I mentioned the Soul Tiller with Regenesis as part of the ability of the deck to restock itself. Dogs tend to bury things in the yard and then dig them up later, or possibly even just forget about them. So with this deck, you want to be able to get some cards back later. So Regenesis lets you return up to 2 permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. Now note that they do not have to be dogs. I can return Door of Destinies or Coat of Arms, which are some of the cards that help the deck to deal a lot of damage. Or Shared Animosity is an enchantment, which I can return as well. The Soul Tiller allows me to shuffle all creature cards of a given type from my graveyard into my library, which allows me to have more hits off of Descendant's Path and allows me to sort of restock my deck that way. It's an interesting little metric because if somebody's trying to mill me, I can put just my dogs back, and so anything else that they milled will stay in the graveyard, and it'll sort of mana severance my own deck to make sure that I'm drawing more gas. It's an interesting little metric, and it has happened before in a game. Additionally, one of the cards that's not as flavorful is Heirloom Blade. It is a good card for creature decks, especially tribal decks. Crypt Creature gets +3/+1, and I have quite a few cards in here where the power matters. And whenever the equipped creature dies, I may reveal cards on the top of the library until I reveal a creature card that shares a type with it. So that way, even if a dog dies, I can get another dog out. So what happens if your dog dies? You go to the store and try to get another one to fill the hole in your heart, right? So what happens if a dog gets to the point where it has to be put down for the greater good? Well, I go get another one to replace it. It'll never replace it completely, certainly not in my heart, but I'll have another dog, something else to love. Rowan is an interesting card, mostly because it sounds like my last name. My last name is Rowe, R-O-W-E. Its name is Rowan, R-O-W-E-N. So that's one of the reasons why the card's in the deck. I'm not going to lie, that actually has something to do with it. But what Rowan does is reveal the first card you draw each turn. Whenever you reveal a basic land card this way, draw a card. So there are only 10 non-basics in the deck. And so Rowan allows me to get through some of those land piles that inevitably happen, especially when the deck is set aside as it is right now. And I'll often use that to be able to keep things going, get past some clumps, and move along. Kindred Summons is another way to sort of mash out a bunch of bodies, get things out there, and produce an army in a card. The dogs are mostly just going to be individual cards. So that's one of the few ways I have to really get a lot out there at a time. I do also have I have it included as more of a ramp card, but it's also a card draw effect in Zendikar Resurgent. Zendikar Resurgent is a card that makes sure my lands produce double, and it also is a card that allows me to draw a card whenever I cast a creature. Since I'm casting a lot of tiny creatures, this allows the effects to snowball and for me to develop a board. In terms of removal, the deck is kind of light. So there are 10 ramp spells, 10 card draw spells, 20 cards that are either creatures or amplification effects for creatures. There are only 10 removal spells. 5 spot removal, and then 5 ways to remove more than one thing at a time. One of the later entries to the deck, but also an important one, is Dogpile. Because it has dog in the name, I have to use it. It's an instant. It deals damage to target creature or player equal to the number of attacking creatures you control. Well, if dogs attack as a pack, it's called Dogpile. I probably need to have it in there. I can use it before I pass priority. So I can attack, put triggers on the stack, and then before I pass priority to the declare blocker step, I can use that to clear a blocker out of the way. I can also use it after, so I can also use it at the end of declare blockers to bash somebody in the face. So Dogpile is a nice little card in there. Rabid Bite, Prey Upon, and Time to Feed are all fight effects that sound like things a dog would do. So they make sense in there. Erratic Portal is kind of like a leash on a dog. It's also one of my favorite cards. It's an unsummoned effect, and it's one of the reasons why the deck exists. So Erratic Portal costs 4, colorless. It's an artifact. I can pay a colorless to return a creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays a colorless. Well, if I'm returning my own creature, I can just opt not to pay the colorless. It can be used as a removal spell against an opponent who taps out, because then it just 1 mana bounces your creature. But it can also be used to bounce my own things to get additional enters the battlefield effects, to remove a creature from combat if I don't have greater good. Anything like that, it can be used to protect things. I can also use it on a willing opponent's creature if they want something bounced. Like, let's say somebody's about to wrath the board. I haven't really developed much, but I have the Erratic Portal out. I can always bounce somebody's creature that would have gotten destroyed. And I've used the Erratic Portal quite a lot for a variety of different purposes. I'm not going to proselytize it too much on here because I could go off for probably an hour just on that card and all the things that it can do. But that brings me to the mass removal. It has Ancient Grudge, which I have mentioned at the beginning of the cast is one of the reasons why the deck exists. Ancient Grudge allows it to destroy an artifact on the front half for a colorless and a red, and then destroy another artifact on the back half for a green. It also has Seeds of Innocence. Bury all artifacts. Each artifact's controller gains life equal to that artifact's CMC or now mana value. Dogs are innocent, so it makes sense that they would plant the Seeds of Innocence. But also, this is a way to destroy all artifacts, but in a way that is friendly to the table. There's a good amount of things in this deck that it'll hit as well, but one of the themes of the deck seems to be that it destroys artifacts. It can also destroy enchantments with Tranquility, because it makes sense that the dogs would want to try to find a peaceful place. You can also send things back to nature, which costs a colorless less than Tranquility and is an instant, which makes it pretty much a better card in almost all circumstances. And then there's the aforementioned Nev's Disc, which is kind of like the frisbee that the dog would chase after. What I haven't talked about yet is this card's mana, and there's a few different ways for it to generate mana and sort of cheat ahead on things. I mentioned Allaren and Urza's Incubator, as well as Zendikar Resurgent. The Allaren and Incubator allow you to cheat on costs. Mana Echoes and Resurgent provide a ton of mana. There are also cards like Druid's Repository and Song of Freyalise, which allow the creatures themselves to create mana when they do things like attack or tap. The Song of Freyalise can also double as a bit of a win condition because when it gets to the third element of the saga, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures get Vigilance, Trample, and Indestructible until end of turn, which can turn them into fairly powerful beasts. But up until that point, for the first two modes, they were essentially Birds of Paradise. So they could tap for mana of any color, and I could use that to have these dogs make more dogs, which of course is something dogs do. That's why there are breeders, right? Another way that dogs can make more dogs is with Belba's Portal. Belba's Portal, when I enter battlefield, choose a creature type. I can pay 3 and tap to put a creature of the chosen type from my hand into play. It's not a great card in there because it does cost a lot of mana. 5 to get out, 3 to activate. Most of my creatures aren't that expensive. If I'm doing that for like a 1/1, there's really not much of a point. But it does allow me to get around counter magic. It allows me to put them out at instant speed, and it allows me to use that instant speed to grant my creatures pseudo haste, which is always valuable in terms of being able to attack as a pack. I do have Rampant Growth in the deck, mostly because I just wanted a 2-mana accelerant. There aren't a lot of 2-mana dogs. Most of them are 1 or 3, and so I slotted it in. Pyre of Heroes is a relatively recent card. If you pay 2 colorless, tap it to sack a creature. To search for a creature card that shares a creature type with the sacrificed creature and has a mana value equal to 1 plus the creature's mana value. So what I can do for that is turn my smaller dogs into bigger dogs. I can do that at sorcery speed, so it's not quite as flexible as some of the other ways to cheat things into play. But it is still a solid card. I also have Pillar of Origins, which is basically a mana rock for tribal spells, and Druid's Repository, which whenever a creature attacks, I put a charge counter on it, and then I can remove charge counters to add mana of any color equal to the amount of charge counters I remove. So I can use that to have my dogs make more dogs. I can use that to have my dogs make post-combat things to do. I can use that to have my dogs attack, have a lot of them die, and then Elvish Soul Tiller to shuffle them all back. I can do a variety of different things like that, where I can use them to create mana that doesn't go away because it's in the form of charge counters. In terms of the lands, there are only a few non-basics. Most of them are fairly standard, like Myriad Landscape, Command Tower, Rogue's Passage, especially powerful with Paco because it makes Paco unblockable, and Paco already gets ridiculously big. And Crystal Vein, which is another way for me to sneak in a ramp spell. It has Gaia's Cradle, which was mentioned earlier as a super mana spell. Cavern of Souls is a way to get around some of the things getting countered. Now, it's not likely somebody's going to counter a dog, but it's possible that there might be some subhumans in your playgroup, and you just want to make sure you're ready. Those blue players, can't imagine why somebody would ever want to play that color. Just kidding, I play Unsummoned. Does have Kessig Wolf Run, because it has wolf in the name. Also because it pumps a creature's power, gives them trample, and can kill somebody with Paco. But also it has wolf in the name, and that's the bigger reason. Mosswarp Bridge is another high power matters, although it cares about the power of the entire battlefield. And it's a hideaway land, which means that I can sometimes sneak something in just by having enough creatures out. I have Path of Ancestry, which adds a mana of any color in my commander's color identity when that's used to cast a creature type that's a dog. Scry 1. I can always use a little bit of extra draw. Animal Sanctuary is less useful, but I have a full art one, and it references dogs. I can tap it for a colorless, or I can pay 2 colorless and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on a bird, cat, dog, ox, goat, or snake. And it doesn't have to be mine, so I can put it on anybody's. But it makes sense for me to want to put it on dogs. So this has been the inaugural episode of the Quote of Arms podcast. So in this Quote of Arms podcast, you're looking at different tribes, and so different tribes within the game of Magic, whether they are supported or unsupported, and basically why people would want to build them. This is meant to be a nice, fun, open podcast, not really talking about any controversial subjects. Today I'm just talking about dogs and how much I love them. So hopefully this has been a fun cast. So this has been Unsummoned Skull, J. Rowe, Coach J. Rowe, however you wish to address me. At Coach_J_RO on Twitter. Twitch.tv/Unsummoned Skull. And you can also find me at the Skull Symbol, which is my Discord community. Have a great day, and I love you all.